I have enjoyed the city of the Romantics very much, and I'll speak a little bit about Romantic economics this evening. And in a way, it's also reflected in the title, Geld and Magie, because Romantics look at the present through the eyes of the past. They're not progressives in the modern sense. And this book is reading the present in the eyes of an old text and an even older myth. And Pope Francis does the same thing in terms of using the Bible to look at our current problems. So, if we look around the world, it's rather obvious that there are problems. In France, they found a 30% decline in birds in the last 15 years. The next one, in Germany, I'm just going to skip forward. In Germany, there was an even more dramatic decline of 78% in 24 years of insects in one particular nature reserve in the northwest. But there's no reason to believe that this would not be replicated if the study was done elsewhere. But the thing is, the study is a bit unique because it was done by lay people, not with scientific funding. It just happened that people who attend this nature reserve were encouraged to keep a record of the insects they saw over a quarter of a century. Those kinds of longitudinal studies are quite expensive to organize, but it was done for almost nothing. But it had this really shocking outcome. In Britain, we talk about the Windscreen Test. So you're driving along, and 30 years ago you have a big scraper, and in the summer every time you stop on the autoroute driving to Perpignan, which I used to do with my kids to go camping in the summer, because Scotland is a cold place normally, except this year, you scrape all the insects off each time, yeah? But now you hardly need to do this anymore in Britain, and I haven't noticed a big problem with insects here either. Though I was in the Schwarzwald last 2 days, and I did see a lot of butterflies that I had not seen before, so there's some hope. We have conventions to try to address what we're doing through the global economy. The UN Convention on Biodiversity, for example, it affirms the intrinsic value of biological diversity, including its ecological, economic, cultural, and aesthetic values, and its importance for sustaining the systems of the biosphere. And it says the conservation of this is a common concern of humankind, but that states have sovereign rights over their biological resources, and states are therefore responsible for conserving their biological diversity. This treaty was ratified in 1992, but it is not working. It's quite clear. And I would suggest one of the main reasons it's not working is because states are not in control of the forces that are causing these declines. They are supranational bodies which are more influential than states. There are many other indices in addition to insects and birds of what we're doing. 38% decline in numbers of mammals, amphibians and birds in around 40 years. Nearly 80% decline in freshwater species, which is a really shocking statistic. 36% decline in marine species. This is in numbers, not species, I should say. The ocean, mammal and fish populations together have declined 89% since the onset of industry. So this is numbers. This is the weight of numbers. I'm not talking about species, but numbers. It's really incredible. But again, you have to use non-standard scientific methods to count that far back. But they do exist. And the study I quote there, Heiko Lotz and Boris Worm, Trends in Ecology, they used journals from fishing boats, especially in the North Atlantic, which are continuous, and it's a good record. But they use other non-standard scientific measures to come up with this shocking statistic. So basically 90% of the fish in the oceans and the mammals on land have disappeared since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And then I've already spoken about insect population decline, and what scientists would say is that the current extinction rates are 1,000 times higher than the natural back-to-run rate, and With climate change, it could approach 10,000. So the conventional environmental approach to resolving these kinds of problems is what we call protected areas. Yeah. So you set aside certain areas for conservation. This began with the Romantic movement in the 18th century. William Wordsworth, Thomas Carlyle, and John Muir in the States and in Britain, and there were analogous moves here. Initially, these were to preserve old buildings, like the ruins, like the castle here. Later, the Romantic idea of conserving ruins spread to conserving landscapes. I don't know the German history as well as I know the British, but that occurred in the 18th century in Britain and in the States, and there was a similar move in France in the 19th century. The problem, though, is that these special areas, like Yosemite, the Lake District, while they may be protected from certain uses, ultimately they are subject to the same forces that influence the world as a whole. Hence, the German study, that is in a protected area, but it isn't making any difference. If you're spraying these chemicals everywhere, the protected areas will be affected as well. Of course, the first person in the 20th century, at least in the English-speaking world, to really draw attention to what we're doing is Rachel Carson in her book Silent Spring. I've found from my classes here that it's not widely read in Germany. But this book was, I think it's reasonable to say, the most influential environmental text, at least in the English-speaking world, in the 20th century. It led to the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which of course Donald Trump is currently trying to destroy. Which then was copied all over Europe and right around the world. One of the most striking things about the book, she draws on a lot of romantic imagery. The phrase "Silent Spring" comes from a poem by John Keats, but it's also passionate and political. This is her speaking to Congress. She says, who has the right to decide for the countless legions of people who were not consulted that the supreme value is a world without insects, even though it's also a sterile world ungraced by the curving wing of a bird in flight? The decision is that of authoritarian temporarily entrusted with power. He has made it during a moment of inattention by millions to whom beauty and the ordered world of nature still have a meaning that is deep and active. Rachel Carson was among the first scientists to go public with the idea that synthetic organic chemicals could spread through waterways and oceans to infect all life. And the most visceral example of this was that DDT was found soon after the publication of her book in the breast milk of women in France. And it soon led then to the banning of DDT. But Carson also taught ecology through this book, including a community ecology. And she argued that man, however much he may like to pretend to the contrary, is part of nature. Can he escape a pollution that is now so thoroughly distributed throughout our world? We all live under the haunting fear that something may corrupt the environment to the point where man joins the dinosaurs as an obsolete form of life. She wrote this, of course, just in the same time as atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons was still proceeding in the late 50s and early 60s. I can still remember, I'm 63, but I can remember TV images from Bikini Atoll, even as quite a small child. It was like they imprinted themselves in some way on my brain. I knew what I was seeing was just really terrifying. So she also was one of the first, but of course there were other texts at the same time. Perhaps the most influential was the Whole Earth Catalogue, to point out that we're all joined together by what we're doing and by the science of ecology. The world is one. There is an ecology of the world in our bodies. In this unseen world, minute causes produce many effects, mighty effects. The effect, moreover, is seemingly unrelated to the cause, appearing in a part of the body remote from the area where the original injury was sustained. A change at one point, in one molecule even, may reverberate throughout the Earth system to initiate changes in seemingly unrelated organs and tissues. But that there is a global way of thinking, acting and speaking is increasingly contested by the globally left behind or globally wasted or deindustrialized communities and their representatives in Britain and the United States. And of course, if you go back in history, and indeed there are still people today for whom the global does not exist in the modern sense. If you look at a hunter-gatherer community, the global is around 40 kilometers in diameter, which is the daily walking distance from one side of the community's forest to the other. There are small groups in the Amazons who still live in the world, no bigger than that. But until the Second World War, most people in Europe lived in the villages and market towns where they were born. And only because of their bicycle did they transit further than a 40-kilometer diameter. The bicycle actually was the most crucial invention in modern times in mixing up human genes and so improving actually the human gene pool, because it meant you could cycle backwards and forwards from your intended beloved in the same day 3 or 4 times that you could go when you were walking. But the point is that until the Second World War, even with bicycles, most people lived in one place. But we now live in this magic world of engines and cargo containers and the movement of stuff. And it's produced a global ecology of movement that displaces communities and ecosystems. Arguably, this global world began with Roman and Byzantine Christianity, more than the Persian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, more than the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire ultimately, and Byzantium, represented a new global macrocosm, emerging out of the spread of one religion geographically from one place to reach as far as the north of Scotland, the Siberia, down into Central Africa, all within the first 400 years of the Christian movement. But what's happened since the discovery of the New World is that we now have a global liberal economic trade regime which spreads the whole way around the world. But it really, you can trace it to the 19th century in terms of its current size because of the increased speed of shipping. This is the container port at Newark, New Jersey. There must be similar ones on the Baltic Ocean, but Newark is pretty apocalyptic in size. But essentially, these money, computers, and logistics represent what one anthropologist calls a global magic of distant expropriation, where a mouse click can literally move the minerals from a mountain into a container like that. And of course, this global movement has been used to dramatically change the way capitalism works locally in Europe and the States. It's massively undermined trade union activity and control of work. And at the same time, the infrastructure of containerized movement displaces nature and sustainable communities. For example, in Romanian agriculture, before Romania joined the European Union, they had by default organic agriculture. They didn't have the money for synthetic chemicals or John Deere tractors. Nor do they have huge 4-lane highways of the kind the European Commission insists must now be driven through the Caucasus in order to draw the Romanian agricultural economy into the economy of Western Europe. But of course, there will be people in Romania who don't want to leave their places. But it's actually the species, more than the people, who can't leave. Endemic species live in particular ecosystems. We may try to move everything around, but ultimately that movement threatens them. They may try to stay in place, but it's difficult. In Britain, of course, the 4 freedoms are very controversial right now. The movements of goods, people, services and capital, which are said, particularly here in Germany, to be inviolably connected. They'll understand that it was a British trade minister who played quite a big role in persuading the Germans of the wisdom of this way of reorganizing the European Union at the time of Maastricht. But free capital has destroyed secure work and even progression from childhood to adulthood, not just in Britain and the States, but in large parts of Europe. 40–50% youth unemployment in Greece, Spain, Portugal, other parts of southern Europe. It's not sustainable. And the resulting resentment supports new identity and place-based politics, which is described as populist by cosmopolitans. Global free trade then moves non-native species to places where they wipe out native non-humans in other ecosystems. And multinational corporations like Bayer and Monsanto, soon to be Bayer Monsanto, I'm not sure which, I think it's just going to be Bayer, lobby multinational bodies like the European Commission and the US federal government to permit the use of systemic pesticides, and which infect the whole genome of the plant from seeds to fruits and poison all life in contact with them. The extent of our interference now, not only through pesticides but through climate change and fossil fuels in the environment, has led many scientists and social scientists to argue that we're now living in a new epoch, which they call the Anthropocene. We move more sediment and rock than all other natural processes put together now. 70% of all land areas are now managed by humans. I've already shown that 90% of all the fish in the oceans have been harvested since, well, either 18 or 1950 is arguable. Land and ocean temperatures are rising, sea levels are rising, biodiversity is declining, soil is eroding, groundwater is diminishing. We are now in charge of the nitrogen and carbon cycles of the planet, more than natural processes. If you look at the socio-economic trends, I'm not going to spend long on these, but you can see all of them show really astonishing changes after the year roughly of 1950. Most have really dramatic takeoff. Scientists often call this now the Great Acceleration, when there was this huge jump in human activity, industrial activity, from 1950 on, and a number of scientists argue that this is when the Anthropocene began, if we can give it a date. You see the effects first off. This is human services and trends of infrastructure, and then you see the Earth system effects very rapidly responding, whether it's CO2 or methane or ocean acidification. In a way, I find this slide quite helpful, quite hopeful, because it shows that it's only 70 years that we've been doing this. We could turn it around then. I mean, if it's so recent, people didn't live badly in 1950. I mean, I was born in 55, but, already by 1950 people had fridges and washing machines, and, life was, longevity was improving, infant mortality was going down. Okay, not for the whole of the world, but people's resource base, even in the rich world, was far lower than it is now. This idea that it's unstoppable, I don't know. I think this is a helpful slide from that point of view, even though it looks depressing in some ways. But it's only 1950, in the memory of some people alive, that we live far more sustainably than we do at the moment. I got into the environmental issues through seeing things like this. I lived for some years in Southeast Asia, and I still work there, and it looks like I'm going to be going back there next year for a few years. And this is a stripped rainforest in Borneo, ready for plantation by oil palm. They took out the forest from these highland areas, and then they bulldoze these terraces. And the terraces they plant, above the terraces they plant, on the terraces they plant the trees, the oil palm trees. And but there are similar, really shocking other things. This is a satellite photograph taken by a friend of mine, or taken from a satellite by a friend of mine. Initially, he didn't know what it was. He sent it to a friend who works on fisheries in Vancouver, BC, University of British Columbia, who said, this is ships off of South China, and they are trawling the ocean. And what they're doing is plowing the ocean, because each line of boats is followed by another line, and the boats behind go in between the first boats. And then there's one more line. And you see, by the end, it's just mud, and nothing much can grow there. I mean, my friend said it's like turning the ocean into a prawn farm, because they've so disrupted the surface of the subsurface that not much can grow there afterwards. These kinds of effects, this kind of scale of intervention, of course, is also producing human, large-scale events. And estimates vary, but some reports suggest 200 million refugees already from environmental disruption around the planet. Many of them never leave their continents. You know, this transmigration across the Mediterranean is quite unusual. Most refugees move within continents, particularly in Africa and in South and Central America. But there are huge numbers of people on the move now because of the scale of what we're doing to ecosystems. So many scientists argue the Anthropocene represents a new spatial order of human activity, and it's a new spatial order because we're influencing now the whole Earth system and not only parts of it. The term was first coined by a Russian scientist early in the 20th century, but it was popularized by the Dutch Earth system and atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen, who argued that the scale of things that we're now doing means, in a sense, we are a geological force. He initially suggested the date for this ought to be 1784, when James Watt invented the condensing steam engine in Edinburgh. More recently, most scientists have coalesced on the date of 1950 because of the Great Acceleration. Now, I'm a theologian, and for me it's very interesting that the first people to argue that we're moving into a new Anthropic era were not scientists, but priests and theologians. So this man, Antonio Stoppani, was a Roman Catholic priest who also studied geology. And he celebrates in his book called Geological, that the extent of the footprint of humans on Earth shows how much we have now in possession of the planet. And he says how many events already bear the trace of this dominion given to us by God. Be fruitful and multiply. He celebrates it. And he says, this is happening when in the world resounded the great word. It's come since the incarnation. When in the bosom of the aged fabric of ancient pagan societies the Christian family was introduced, the new element par excellence, the substituted ancient slavery with freedom, darkness with light, fall and degeneration with rebirth, and the true progress of humanity. So I find it, for me, it's really interesting that among the first people to announce this new human era were theologians who saw it as a sign of the incarnation and the success of Christianity as a religion transforming the human condition on earth from one of darkness to light, from paganism to the Enlightenment. There's a second quote. There's not time to read both of these quotes out, but I have put these up online in the e-learning system, and I can make the slides available later if you would like. But essentially, Stoppani is celebrating what he calls the Anthropozoic era that we now live in, and I find that Crutzen is in that sense quite similar, in the sense that he is saying that the plunder and the pollution will carry on, but that we will have vastly improved technology and management, and then these will lead us to wise use of the Earth's resources, to control of human and domestic animal populations. I find that a particularly disturbing phrase, the control of human and domestic animal populations, and overall careful manipulation and restoration of the natural environment. Humankind, then, he says, is bound to remain a noticeable geological force as long as it's not removed by diseases, wars, or serious destruction of a life support system, which is so generously provided by nature, cost-free. Now, for earlier theological proponents of modernity as a new epoch, and these include John Ruskin, Tyler DeShatter, and Tom Berry, the moral of this idea of a new age of humans is quite different from what Crutzen and Stoppani suggest. Ruskin thought that the lawless modern economy was the reason air in cities was killing his contemporaries, and he argued for an end to a debt-based, profit-oriented capitalism which was contrary to religious principles of Christian and Islamic traditions on usury, debt, and wealth accumulation without restraint. In his famous book, Unto This Last, which comes this famous phrase, "There is no wealth but life." And he also thought that he could detect that this new industrialism was having effects on the atmosphere, and he writes this famous essay, The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, where he's saying that he thinks that what is happening to the weather, which he thinks is a new thing, is a result of the burning of coal and in factories, and what he calls, in the last phrase there, Manchester's devil, darkness. He speculated that the result of this atmospheric change would be that Turner, who painted these paintings that Ruskin was a great advocate for as a professor of art at Oxford University, would no longer see sunsets like this. And indeed, we are seeing much redder and pinker sunsets and less yellow and orange because of the amount of particulates in the atmosphere these days. But of course the painting itself, in a way, is also a protest, right, by another romantic, because here you have the steamship contending with the sailing ship, and the portent then of the New Age is already being considered in contrast to the beauty of the sunset. I never really would have thought to call the Pope a romantic. But it seems to me that Laudato Si represents, by Pope Francis, represents an analogous romantic reading of the signs of the times that we're living in to those of Ruskin and others who were concerned at the direction of the industrial economy right back in the 19th century. At the beginning of 2015, to bring in what is known in Catholic circles as the Year of Mercy, which meant it was a year you could go to St. Peter's and get time off in Purgatory if you went to St. Peter's that year. I don't think I went, so I missed that opportunity. But they still believe, well, they do still believe all this stuff, at the indulgences and everything that we like to think the Reformation disposed of in parts of Northern Europe. But to bring the year about, Francis had created this amazing Soleil Lumiere display. And it was also the year of the publication of Laudato Si, when endangered species were projected onto the walls of St. Peter's. And it was quite remarkable. And in Laudato Si, the Pope argues that we have a problem with the environment, and one of the main causes of it is what he calls a magical conception of the market. For the Pope, it's quite clear that the monetization of life is fostering a new instrumentalising discourse in which humans, other animals, and whole ecosystems are becoming resources. He says that this is a problem because everything ultimately comes down to the increase in profits of companies and individuals. Where profits alone count, there can be no thinking about the rhythms of nature, its phases of decay and regeneration, the complexity of ecosystems which may be gravely upset by human intervention. Moreover, biodiversity is considered at most a deposit of economic resources available for exploitation, with no serious thought for the real value of things, their significance for persons and cultures, or the concerns and needs of the poor. Like the Pope, Alf Homburg, in a book called Global Magic, argues that the growth of societal capital is inversely related to the growth of natural capital. Money, he argues, is the root of this. Money inevitably becomes an end in itself when it is attributed with intrinsic value, as when precious metals or bills are hoarded or stolen, or when interest accrues in bank accounts. This is money fetishism. Hornburg argues the steam engine, here it's reminiscent of Crutzen's early paper on the Anthropocene, was the origin of the new global era of monetization and economic growth, which resulted in the detachment of the human economy from the economy of the earth, which is why some people call the Anthropocene the Capitalocene, not the Anthropocene. Now, I'm quite interested in this whole issue of monetization, but it's quite hard to track down accurate figures, much like it's quite difficult to get an accurate log of how many fish have disappeared from the seas. To get anything like a long-term view on the rise in the quantity of money in circulation is very, very difficult. But one quite helpful graph is this one. And this shows the rise in values of silver, gold bullion, the Dow Industrial Average, and a composite price index of the three over a period from 1985 to 2010. And you can see just astonishing rises in all four statistics then. And if you were to lay alongside this rise in global emissions of greenhouse gases, you would see a kind of correlation. And indeed, I argued in A Moral Climate, a book I wrote about 10 years ago now, that global monetary growth could be mapped onto growth in carbon emissions since the 50s. Hornberg makes a similar argument, but he takes it even further back. He says what he calls general purpose money, so that's like euro or dollars, it can be used really anywhere in the world, has become a global flux, drawing all peoples and ecosystems into a global system of appropriation of extreme inequality, which again, like the global economy that I argued earlier comes from the 19th century, should be traced back to the 19th century. Now I'm going to very briefly run through one example of this global appropriation because it's very biographically relevant to me. So this is Borneo, and the highest mountain in Borneo, which I've not yet climbed, but I'd love to one day. And this is what's happening to much of Borneo. I showed you that earlier slide. This is an oil palm plantation that's going to replace a forest in the state of Sarawak. The forests of Borneo are being destroyed, their rich biodiversity and human culture is eroded, the stored greenhouse gases and the carbon in the peat particularly is being released into the atmosphere, and this is being done for short-term profit from global, but it also feeding EU primary resource markets for tropical timber and tropical plantation products, including European Commission mandated biofuels. I've seen the effects of this firsthand. In 1987, I met a flying doctor who told me she was visiting tribal communities in the highland interior, many miles from the riverbanks we were traveling on, and she found people suffering from malnutrition because the fish had disappeared from the rivers because of the silt, from the logging. The mammals, there was nowhere for them to live, they'd been killed too. So basically, people were suffering from malnutrition in one of the most fertile places on Earth because of the attack on their land and its conversion into oil palm. And yet we have this thing called the European Commission Renewable Energy Directive, which says 10% of liquid fuels in the European Union must be composed of plant-derived fuels by 2020. The majority of the liquid in the 10% is oil palm from tropical forests, like the ones I've just showed you. Europe says it's doing this to meet its Kyoto Protocol and Paris Accord targets. But the science clearly shows that if biofuels come from tropical forests, they're actually worse than light crude from Saudi Arabia. They're worse actually than the crude that comes out of the North Sea, which has got much heavier footprint, but it's much harder to get it out of the sea. But the EU directive that led to this mandates the use of biofuels to help the European community meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals through the decarbonisation of transport fuel, and to reduce life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from the fuel and energy supply of European vehicles. It acknowledges the incentives provided for this in the directive will increase production of biofuels worldwide, but it argues that increasing worldwide demand for biofuels and the incentives for their use provided by the directive shouldn't have the effect of encouraging the destruction of biodiverse lands. So to me, the whole heart of this argument, can you decarbonize? Can we carry on with an upward path in growth at the same time as addressing sustainability is in the text of this directive. They assume the market will increase, but then they go on to say it won't really affect biodiversity and sustainability. But that's not what's happened. Biofuel provision, they say, should be subject to sustainability criteria. And they shouldn't originate in biodiverse areas. Or where are these deserts where we're going to grow biofuels? I mean, it's only deserts, so they're not biodiverse, right? And in reality, of course, ECRED led to a 5-fold increase in the market of palm oil as biodiesel. It's the largest single plant source of European biodiesel. It's also in petrol as well as in biodiesel, I now realize. ECRED incentivizes companies and national agencies to grow more biofuels. It incentivizes growth in the biofuel industry. The Commission says that since primary forests are gazetted worldwide by government agencies, it should be possible to prevent the marketing of biofuels from land converted from primary forests. But there's no mechanism or certification scheme to ensure biofuels, which are liquids, refined mostly in the country of origin, shipped thousands of miles to places like Rotterdam. There's no mechanism to ensure they don't come from primary rainforests. And then you look at this. This is a map from one of the big companies in Southeast Asia showing their expansion plans. So you have Myanmar there, which is currently one of the most endangered places in terms of increasing logging. Borneo is nearly finished in terms of primary forests, except for small protected areas, and Sumatra is undergoing. And then you have Papua and West Papua and Papua New Guinea. So the directive is pushing the logging into all these new areas. And you can also see Laos, but Laos isn't as badly affected. So the claim is EQUATE gives us carbon savings while protecting biodiversity, while not reducing energy consumption. Well, I'm afraid the claim is not real. This is a graph from a scientific paper which clearly evidenced that actually the carbon emissions from biofuels are higher than carbon emissions from conventional fuels. So CO2 is not actually reduced by turning to biofuels at all. It may salve our consciences to think we're not getting so much oil out of the ground, but we're putting more CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is a photograph, it's hard to see in the light, but of smoke from forest fires in Sumatra, which affected the peninsula of Malaysia and much of Southeast Asia in 1997. And they've had most summers, they have similar incidents. And these are caused by rapid burning of the forest. The forest is set by subcontractors, but the subcontractors are employed by the oil palm companies. And you get these hotspots. There's a map of the hotspots where all the fires are burning. Singapore complains, but of course Singapore is a tax haven, and most of the Malaysian, Indonesian oil palm companies now have their quarters in Singapore to avoid taxes in Indonesia and Malaysia. So they don't complain very much because their stock exchange partly relies on the values of the oil palm, which is poisoning their atmosphere. So it's an absolutely classic kind of Anthropocene story. It's not, but it happens to one I've lived in the middle of, which is why I mention it. Now, there have been attempts to produce a more transparent regime in oil palm production, in particular the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I've interviewed some of the people who set that up in Southeast Asia. Some of them actually were churchgoers, but it's not working. Some of the worst fires in recent times have come from RSPO certified plantations. Well, obviously there's civil society pressure in Europe. This led to a debate in the European Parliament in which the MEPs passed a motion in 2017 calling on the European Commission to phase out vegetable oils from biofuels in Europe by 2020. The Commission hasn't responded, and Malaysia and Indonesia have said that if they do, then they will raise a trade dispute in the WTO. The conversion of so much of Borneo from primary forest to oil palm has occasioned an ecological disaster on an unprecedented scale in Borneo. Behind this disaster, there's a systemic political corruption, extensive criminal activity, and destruction of the habitats of native peoples. In Sarawak, the people most affected by the destruction were the nomadic Penans. Though under Malaysian customary law, adat, they ought to be considered owners of the forest, since they lived in them for generations. This ownership is not recognized by the government of Sarawak, which was headed for 2 decades by a man called Taib Mahmud, who put together a property empire of $15 billion by burning the forest and turning it into oil palm. And it's recorded in this book by a Swiss, Lucas Straumann, called Money Logging on the Trail of the Asian Timber Mafia. Of course, he thought he could persuade the Swiss government not to publish the book, but he doesn't quite understand how European democracies work. This is just a rather romantic picture of Penang people. They do somehow still manage to live in the forest, some of them. Many of them have got involved now in campaigns to protect the forests, and one of the last really successful attempts to preserve a large area from oil palm plantations came about as a result of wide-scale protection by the native people, which is against the law, and they're threatened with imprisonment, but now that area of protection has been acknowledged by the government. Now, what's this all got to do with economics? I'm just going to skip this slide. These just provide some evidence. But this one might be helpful. The Chief Minister of Sarawak, Taib Mahmud, appointed his own land custody and development authority to act as a trustee on behalf of native landowners when negotiating with concession holders. Concession holders are people who get a concession to chop down a forest. And basically, when you look at the trustee document, it allows Taib to do what he likes with that land. It's kind of almost official. So there is an interaction then in this tropical deforestation between criminality and corruption, and primary forest exploitation and wealth accumulation. But of course it's facilitated through international financial agencies and technologies. Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, and other international agencies provided Taib and his family enterprises with international investment capital to grow their businesses and the financial means, instruments to move the money around and hide it in buildings rented by the FBI in Seattle, in Australia, in apartment blocks in Sydney, and all over the place. This is how it's done. Deutsche Bank raised Taib and his businesses over $700 million US dollars in investment capital in the form of bond issues and loans to fund the continued expansion of his family and cronies' tropical lodging and land conversion activities. It's really shocking. But we think here we are in Europe, is properly regulated and democratic and law governed. So our agencies, our people, don't do this kind of thing, right? Well, this is Hornburg's point in this coining this phrase global managed. It's still going on. This is the post-colonial capitalist regime. It's still going on, putatively, lawfully, but actually directly connected with criminality and destruction. Why don't economists sort of see this corrupt role of general purpose money? For most economists, money is like oil and wheels of commerce. But in truth, money is a fetish, which reifies the personal and spiritual energies in human interaction with creation and nature and other persons. The monopolization or capture of money by central and commercial banks is the alchemy Goethe allegorized in Faust, as Hans Christoph Bingswanger shows in this wonderful book, Geld und Magie. It underwrites unequal global exchanges, such as the theft of Borneo's forests and the translation of that theft into property empires belonging to one family with the aid of commercial banks. The decentralization of money power and its continued localization here in Germany and Sparkasse is, I think, the key, I'm not alone in thinking this, to the success of the German economic model. But even here in Germany, I'm told that is under threat as the ECB and the EC push forward levels of regulation and scrutiny, putatively to deal with lack of transparency, but ultimately they will produce a centralization of the German banking model, which ultimately leads to this weird global magic where nobody quite knows what's happening to the money. The monopolization of money has a long history. I mean, what is money? It's social value, ultimately. And I think the first example of the monopolization of money that I can find in the language of myth is actually the story of the adoration of the golden calf. So in the 1930s, the American Federal Reserve Bank was given the statutory power by the American government to help deal with the Depression, to require everybody in the United States to hand over the gold that they owned and silver in their possession. And in exchange for it, they were given paper money. So you have central banks monopolizing, quite explicitly, people's wealth. The first example of this is Aaron's golden calf. And the golden calf, of course, is represented in the Bible as an idol. But it's an idol in competition with the Ten Commandments. So at the same time as Moses is up the mountain receiving his work of art, because the commandments were inscribed on stone, his brother is down below gathering all the value from the people of Israel who've just left Egypt and been given all their gold to leave. And you have this, therefore, right back in the Old Testament, this two ways, that of the creator redeemer and that of the artificer idolater, which Moses, of course, symbolized when he melted the golden calf into a serpent and held it aloft and said, there's two ways here, life and death. I think Binswanger's interpretation of Goethe's Faust is very similar to that reading I've just given you of those two kinds of inscription in the Old Testament. In Goethe's Faust, Binswanger shows that the counter-spirit Mephistopheles gives to Faust the power of alchemy. It's symbolized by the chemical wedding of the elephants of Mercury, which represents paper money in the myth, and sulfur, which represents interest and capital. The alchemy of paper money is scattered everywhere like wildfire blazing as currency, and none its course may stop. It gives to Faust and the state power over the force of nature, to appropriate nature as property, and to create value out of nothing. And the creation of value through money creation is magical because, of course, it is not attributable to human effort, which is labor. Magic of this kind then combines the transformation of mineral resources, gold and silver, into paper money with the power of a state which legitimizes money, the seizure of land and coastlines as property, and the expansion of the state's influence through transport. So the first bank, of course, I mean, Goethe's Faust was written in the 19th century, but the first bank to succeed in this Faustian endeavour of paper money was the Bank of England, which was set up in 1695 after the defeat of the English army and the takeover of the English crown by the Protestant Dutchman William of Orange. The Bank of England's temple-like building contains, curiously, many symbolic references to the dragon or serpent, which for many conservative Christians means that it's filled with images of Satan, because conservative Christians, including in Southeast Asia, the Chinese Christians think that the dragon imagery in their culture is highly problematic because they associate it with the tempter. Of course, the original tempter was a dragon, right? And after the fall, he loses his feet and he becomes a snake. And so I started to look around the Bank of England when I was thinking this through, and I found images all over the place in that building of serpents and snakes. The bottom image there is a plaster cast from the room where the Monetary Policy Committee meets every month to decide whether interest rates should go up or down in the United Kingdom. On the one side, she's holding, balances looking like a banker, and then what's the dragon doing there? I mean, it's very, very curious. Well, Binswanger, of course, is in the same line. He's arguing that there's a kind of mythological element. There's a quasi-religious element to what began in England. Starting out from the 19th century, well, I would say the 17th anyway, England legally authorised paper money, supplemented by the book money of private commercial banks, and began a march of triumphs that would soon conquer the whole world. It became the basis for English world power and her domination of world trade. A little further on this line, every year around the City of London, which is a corporation inside England, it's a separate legal and statutory and political domain. Every year they put these two up on kind of poles and march them around the city. They are the protectors of the City of London. But again, here they are in the Book of Revelation as somewhat ambiguous figures. So it's very curious that there is this quasi-mythical element, not only as Goethe is arguing in Faust in relation to money, but in relation to the symbolism adopted by the first successful bank, to use paper money, the Bank of England. Conventionally, of course, the Reformation is said to have eradicated magic and the corruption of ceremony in which Christian rituals were performed for money, and the medieval stairway to heaven through Purgatory was monetized through Redundancies. But instead, the Reformation led to the monopolization of magic by the state Leviathan and its issuing of paper money through the first central banks in England and Scotland. This is the Bank of Scotland, by the way. Many women were burned as witches in Edinburgh just a few yards from this building, as spiritual healing powers were being monopolized by the professions in the enlightened city and the pre-enlightened city of Edinburgh. But I find it really curious that the Reformation's claim to have eradicated magic gave us a new magic. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis contrasts the magic monetization of human and human earth relations with the divine ecology of love, which upholds cosmic and creaturely beings. He makes a theological contrast between the false magic of monetary value, creation out of nothing by interest-bearing debt and paper money, and the privatization of public and natural assets like water and the atmosphere, and the true magic of divine creation of the cosmos and biodiversity out of love for humanity and creatures, and its expression of the eternal values of goodness, beauty, and truth. We need to reject, he says, a magical conception of the market. Where profits alone count, there can be no thinking about the rhythms of nature. Thinking along these lines then, led me to think, well, perhaps Pope Francis has got more in common with Ruskin and Goethe than one would imagine. Is he really like a neo-romantic? A sober look at our world shows that the degree of human invention, often in the service of business interest and consumerism, is making our world less rich and beautiful, more limited and grey. We seem to think we can substitute an irreplaceable, irretrievable beauty with something we have created ourselves. It's a sentiment that could have been echoed by any of the romantics in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Of course, the Pope also argues that the root of this is atheism and scientism, which subvert belief in a divine creation, and hence a belief that there is a correlation between divine ideas, their symbolic creative forms, in nature itself and the human mind. Consequently, commerce, consumerism, technology misshape contemporary humans to overpower and homogenize the diverse ideals in creation. What moderns call values, including beauty, goodness and truth, in the papal conception originate in God and are present as forms in the divine creation. Values are not made by humans on this account, but they are perceived by them if they are compassionate and virtuous. So in the account of integral ecology, Francis refers to the idea of land and the creation as a divine gift rather than a commodity. He refers to the need to restrain greenhouse gas emissions to protect the climate. He argues all non-humans, all species, will be caught up and redeemed in the eschaton. And he refers to the needs of people in cities for green spaces, unpolluted air, beautiful buildings and squares, to drink unpolluted water, and so on. The vision of integral ecology in Laudato Si includes much which is only mainstream in radical environmentalism, including an argument that we need a circular economy in the way we organize industrialism. And in the background of this slide, you have the, I think, quite magical mosaic in the apse of the Church of San Clemente in Rome, where you can see coming out of the foot of the cross all the different species and creatures, not only humans, caught up in the redemptive power of the cross from the Father in heaven down to the subsoil. I love that. I love that. Totally love that mosaic. I think it's completely amazing. But I guess the question, though, is how might a neo-romantic ecology of love resist and revise the growing inequality between peoples, a growing asymmetry between humans and the earth, which are the dark side of exponential money creation and the Anthropocene? Eckhart, Ruskin, Goethe and Francis, there needs to be greater recognition that the earth and nature are being despoiled by a cult. Not just by science, not just by progress, but by a cult, the cult of money creation. For the cult to be dethroned, it first needs to be named as a cult, as a religion, a false religion, exposed thereby and demystified. And that, I think, is what Binswanger was doing in that book, which is why I was so delighted when I discovered that he's associated with this Fest. Money creation, though, for decades, you couldn't write about it if you're an economist. It was like a heresy. In fact, my friend Richard Werner, who was here in Heidelberg just last week and joined me in one of my classes, he's been drummed out of his university, his business school, because he's given lectures and written papers on money creation. And it's like, this doesn't happen. He actually did an empirical study of how a local bank in the south of England lends money. It's not a local bank, it's a branch of one of the national banks. We have very few banks in Britain. And he traced all the ways in which loans are made in this bank. And he showed in the way the accounts are run, that what happens in the process of someone taking out a car loan or a mortgage is that what the bank does is they take the signed document as security for the loan. They then put that document as a value, an asset, to the value of the security, into the assets of the bank, and they then create in the debit column to match the new asset the equivalent amount of money, which they then deposit in the bank account of the person. So he shows, and then he wrote a paper on this, he actually shows that money creation happens. But then I was amazed. I was reading a book by Mervyn King, who was the central banker who oversaw the collapse of the British economy just a few years ago. And he wrote a biography just after retiring. And in that book, he writes about money creation. And so it's now kind of acknowledged, and the Bank of England have written a paper on it. And then you have the Swiss referendum on money creation just a few weeks ago. Okay, they voted against the proposal, but the alternative proposal was that the central bank should monopolize money creation, which was not, I think, a very good alternative. I'm glad they voted against it. Well, Binswanger's whole argument is that money creation is what's fueled the birth of global capitalism, the end of patrimony, the idea that we produce in such a way that we pass the earth on to those who come next in at least as good a condition as we inherited it. And he argues that it's money creation which led to the re-emergence of the Roman idea of property as absolute dominion over what we possess, over what we buy with our creative money. So representations of creative values in production then do not account, this is the basic point, in Dieter Helm's book Natural Capital, for the destruction of natural values. Dieter Helm is probably the most influential environmental economist in Britain. He's been very influential with all governments, Tory and Labour, for about the last 30 years. He's overseen the setting up of something called the Natural Capital Committee in the UK, and he argues in his book Natural Capital that it's possible to resolve the problems Binswanger and others criticized with money creation by incorporating the depletion or destruction of natural values through modifications to natural and company accounts. Companies and individuals would then pay rents on depletion of non-renewable assets, such as oil and natural gas. And these will be reflected in the higher price of products, which should be required also to incorporate compensation for those affected by environmental costs or environmental destruction, i.e. the polluter-pay model. I've just been reading Natural Capital in the last month. I'm not convinced by it, quite honestly. But it hasn't been tried yet. The committee has been formed, but the policy has not been rolled out. As you may know, the British government's been a little distracted by something else recently, and it looks like being distracted for a while longer. Laudato, I think, makes a far more radical case than Dieter Helm, though, for ecological ethics and economics. It opposes privatization of common resources as morally wrong, since the creation belongs to God. It proposes creatures are intrinsically valuable. They can't just be put on a ledger and done away with, as Dieter Helm thinks maybe can be done. It says that species and ecosystems are the reflections of divine goodness, beauty and truth, and we therefore ought to treat them as intrinsically valuable. It recognizes the intrinsic worth of creative values, which then relativizes human creative values. And Laudato commends the reconnection of production processes with nature and the circular economy, and of persons with nature, through an ecology of love for creatures. And where there are conflicts in resource access, Laudato says these should be moderated by recognition of the needs of the poor and the universal destination of goods. I'm coming quite quickly to my conclusion. When Ruskin is thinking about this new human industrial-dominated age, he draws an analogy with the stilling of the storm on the lake. This, of course, is Rembrandt's wonderful. I think it's my favourite painting of Rembrandt. I mean, I like The Night Watchman. I'm not Dutch. It doesn't do anything for me. But I totally love this painting. It's very soft as well. There's something about it. But here's Ruskin. Whether you can affect the signs of the sky or not, you can the signs of the times. Whether you can bring the sun back or not, you can assuredly bring back your own cheerfulness, your own honesty. You may not be able to say to the winds, peace be still, but you can cease from the insolence of your own lips and the troubling of your own passions. And all that it would be extremely well to do, even though the day were coming when the sun should be as darkness and the moon as blood. But the paths of rectitude and piety once regained, who shall say the promise of old time will not be found to hold for us also? Bring ye all the tithes into my storehouse, and prove me now herewith, says the Lord God, if I will not still open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. So for Ruskin, the Anthropocene is a spiritual opportunity to turn our ways around, to restrain ourselves. And Pope Francis makes very similar claims in Laudato Si, referring back, of course, to his patron saint, after whom he named himself, for integral ecology. He says that all creatures are connected, and therefore we must cherish and love and respect them all, and moderate our desires in relation to their needs. And then he quotes, of course, St. Francis himself, praise be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love. Everything is connected, the Pope says. Concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings, an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. Well, there's another slide from the Sonnet Nublier I mentioned earlier. But in conclusion then, the Romantics, including John Ruskin and Goethe, like the American transcendentalist Henry Thoreau, thought that encounters with the natural order, since it is divinely made and inspired, would shape virtuous persons. And you get that also from reading Laudato Si. As Thoreau famously said, in wilderness is the preservation of the world. Through encounters with the wild, persons, they believe, would learn to fit their needs and desires to uphold and enhance the goodness, beauty and truth of nature and society. And so the origins of modern conservation lie in this romantic location of virtue in what some have called the solace of fierce landscapes. But the Anthropocene raises the question in a sharp way how this kind of experiential environmentalism might reshape the false religion of money and consumerism. At the origins, of course, of modern classical economics, the Anglican clergyman Thomas Malthus argued there are limits to the capacity of the earth to sustain the new masses of industrial society. The announcement of the Anthropocene is, I would suggest, a Malthusian moment. But Malthus was no distributist. He thought the strong would basically see off the weak. But then, of course, Haber-Bosch proved him wrong. Some say technology will save us from the Anthropocene by allowing us to harvest resources on other planets. And that reminds me of Neil Young. This was a kind of anthem of my youth after the gold rush. And it talks about the silver seed of the Earth being taken out into space onto another planet, which will be the new home in the sun. And it's rather ironic, I think, at the very time when humanity is faced with exile from the home planet, hundreds of millions of people are already exiles from dwelling places made uninhabitable by climate change. Humanity has invented a global magic money machine that allows a tiny minority to exile their wealth onto treasure islands and tax havens and floating yachts. Well, I would suggest that the Bible has seen all this before. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there's no room, and you dwell alone in the land. And the prophet goes on, many houses will become desolate, great mansions left unoccupied, 10 acres of vineyard will yield but a bath of wine. Before Pope Francis, the Hebrew prophets blamed exile on the rich. They blamed the exile on the failure of the rich to honour the Mosaic covenant, to distribute the land equitably to all the tribes. And they said that the greed and idolatry had overturned nature's order. But they also thought the new covenant would turn things around towards the peaceable kingdom. And I'll end with this slide. This is, of course, the famous Isaiah 65. And Isaiah thought, I think it's quite clear that this was going to happen in history. This is the Messianic age. And the early Christians thought, when the Messiah came, that these things would be fulfilled. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. No longer will they build houses for others to inhabit, nor plants for others to eat. For as is the lifetime of a tree, so will be the days of my people, and my chosen ones will fully enjoy the work of their hands. They will not labour in vain, or bear children doomed to disaster. They will be a people blessed by the Lord, they and their descendants with them. For me, the great irony of Christian history is that, as I argued earlier, it has joined up the world. The global empire was preceded by the Christian empire. And with that joining up, humans are living longer. Children are dying less frequently in infancy. More people own their own houses, and here in Germany own their own small businesses. But to me, that is under threat in the Anthropocene. But it's also under threat in the extreme inequality that I would argue a post-Christian, pagan, possibly even devil-worshipping, if you go along with Binswanger, cult of money creation is substituting for Christianity in my nation, your nation, and in most other Christian nations on this planet. When you put it like that, it is important for theologians to talk about this. You can only demystify a cult if you're going to explain it as a cult, what cults are, what religion is, why we need religion, and how we get back to the true religion. And that, of course, is what I think Isaiah was trying to get at. Thank you very much.